When the smoke of the Great War cleared and the boys came marching home, America stood at a strange crossroads. The world had changed and so had the country. But instead of dwelling on sorrow, the 1920s felt like someone turned up the volume of life. Jazz spilled into the streets, skirts got shorter, radios buzzed with new sounds, cities reached higher, and in the background, factories hummed, the stock market danced, and Americans, it seemed, were ready to leave the past behind very fast. But beneath that rhythm and dazzle, not everything was shiny as it looked. There were cracks under the surface, unrest in the workplace, fear of immigrants, a battle over values, and haunting question: what does normal really mean? Welcome back to US History Understanding This Country. I am so glad you are here. If you have been enjoying this journey from the founding ideals to the roaring energy of this post war decade, I would love your support. A follow, a review, or even just sharing this episode with a curious friend goes a long way. Alright, let's step into the glitter and grit of the roaring 20s, a decade that danced on the edge of the change. After the chaos of World War I, Americans were desperate for calm. President Warren G. Harding tapped into the desire with a simple promise: a return to normalcy. No more foreign entanglements, no more upheavals, just peace, prosperity, and good old fashioned American life. But what exactly was normal in 1920? Let's start with the economy. The US had powered through the war with booming industry, but once the war ended, the machine stuttered. Soldiers came back looking for jobs and found the factories already packed or scaling back. Prices had skyrocketed during the war, but wages didn't keep up. Inflation hit hard, and soon strikes started rolling in. In 1919 alone, there were more than 3,600 strikes across the country. Steelworkers, police officers in Boston, coal miners in Pennsylvania. It felt like everything was up for grabs, and for many Americans, that was terrifying. People started whispering about communists and anarchists, especially after the Russian Revolution just a few years earlier. Labor demands were no longer seen as just economic, they were painted as dangerous, foreign, and even un American. And then came the rise of nativism and racism, not quietly but loudly and proudly. The 1920s saw the Ku Klux Klan surge back into the national spotlight, no longer just targeting African Americans, but also Catholics, Jews, immigrants, and anyone who didn't fit their narrow vision of America. Their marches weren't hidden in shadows anymore. They walked straight down Pennsylvania Avenue in broad daylight. So while the country was trying to settle down, it was actually boiling under the surface. Returning to normal? Maybe. But it was new kind of normal, and it wasn't the same for everyone, not by a long shot. And just as this cultural anxiety built up, fear took on a new name, the Red Scare. If 1920s was a stage, fear was quickly becoming the spotlight. Not fear of poverty or crime, but fear of ideas, dangerous ideas, they said, foreign ideas, the kind that came with clenched fists and red flags. This was the first Red Scare, and it hit America with a punch in the gut. The Russian Revolution had just upended old world order. The Bolsheviks had stormed in, overthrown Tsar, and declared a new kind of government, communism. For the American elite, it was like watching a match being dropped into a dry forest. And when labor strikes began rippling through the US cities, many feared the fire had already started here. Were workers just asking for better pay, or were they planning a revolution here? That fear didn't stay theoretical, it got personal, really fast. In 1919, a series of bombings rocked the country. One was aimed at the US Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer. Though no one was ever convicted, anarchists were blamed, and Palmer responded like a man with something to prove. He launched what became known as Palmer raids, rounding up thousands of suspected radicals, many of them immigrants. People were arrested without warrants, homes were searched without cause, and hundreds were deported without trials. Then came the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, two Italian immigrants and self proclaimed anarchists accused of robbery and murder. Their trial became national obsession. The evidence was shaky, but their politics made them guilty in the eyes of many. Despite worldwide protests and doubts about the verdict, they were executed in 1927. The message was loud and clear: in the land of the free, not all ideas are welcome. It wasn't just about communism, it was about control control over who belonged, what could be said, and what America was supposed to be. A country once known as a refuge for dreamers had begun putting up walls not just at its borders, but in its heart. That tightening grip extended all the way to the top, including a president with a friendly smile and a scandal waiting to explode. When President Warren G. Harding entered the White House in 1921, America was emotionally exhausted. The Great War had left a bitter aftertaste. Labor unrest, racial violence, and Red Scare had only deepened the national anxiety. Harding's promise of a return to normalcy sounded like a warm bath, familiar, comforting, and quiet. Under the old school brand of pro business republicanism that believed prosperity would trickle down if government simply stepped back. His administration swiftly slashed taxes, reduced public spending, and dismantled wartime regulations. Wall Street rejoiced. Factories buzzed again. The stock market climbed. It was a pivot from progressive reform to laissez faire, and it came with consequences. Harding wasn't an ideologue, though. By many accounts, he was a genial man who enjoyed poker, bourbon, and long talks with friends. He also didn't like being president. He once confessed, I am not fit for this office and should never have been here. That was in humility. It was a man keenly aware that the presidency required tough decisions and strong boundaries, things he struggled with. His biggest flaw wasn't corruption itself, but complacency towards it. Harding filled his cabinet with a mix of capable statesmen and shady loyalists. The worst offenders came from a group jokingly known as the Ohio Gang, his friends and political backers from his home state who saw public office as an open bar. Then came the Teapot Dome scandal, a mess so large it would rival Watergate in the decades to come. At the heart of it was Albert B. Fall, Harding's Secretary of Interior. In a quiet transfer of authority, Fall convinced Harding to move control of valuable oil reserves previously held by the Navy into his department. Once he had them, Fall illegally leased those reserves to private oil companies in secret deals without competitive bidding. In return, he received cash, livestock, even interest free loans. One of the most notorious leases involved a field in Wyoming known as Teapot Dome, named for its oddly shaped rock formation. Fall was eventually convicted for bribery, making him the first former cabinet official in the US history to serve prison time. But the damage went far beyond Fall himself. The scandal exposed the deep vulnerabilities in American democracy, how easily cronyism and unchecked capitalism could undermine public trust. Harding died suddenly in 1923 while on a presidential tour of Western US before the full scandal broke. Though the official cause was a heart attack, the timing led to years of whispers, rumors, and speculations, even theories that his wife poisoned him to protect his reputation or shield him from disgrace. There was no strong evidence to support that, but the murky ending felt fitting for an administration tangled in shadows. After Harding's death, Vice President Calvin Coolidge was sworn in, famously by the light of kerosene lamp in his father's Vermont farmhouse. Where Harding had been sociable and relaxed, Coolidge was stiff, silent, and morally austere. He rarely spoke unless absolutely necessary, earning him the nickname Silent Cal. But he wasn't disengaged. He simply believed that the best government was the least government. Coolidge picked up where Harding left off, doubling down on pro business policies, budget cuts, and tax reductions. Under him, the federal government shrank even as the private sector boomed. Coolidge didn't just tolerate capitalism, he worshipped it. The business of America is business, he famously declared. He kept a tight lid on rhetoric, but behind the silence was a steady hand, one that believed government should serve markets, not meddle in them. While scandals like Teapot Dome had shaken public trust, Coolidge's calm demeanor and clean image helped restore confidence in Washington. The nation exhaled, ever so slightly. But under that polished surface, fault lines were forming, not in policy speeches or stock reports, but in the lives of everyday people navigating a country that was changing faster than they could keep up with. By the time Calvin Coolidge assumed the presidency in 1923, America was basking in the glow of post war prosperity, or at least that was the illusion. The trauma of World War I had left Americans craving order, predictability, and peace. Harding had promised a return to normalcy, and Coolidge, his vice president turned successor, seemed to deliver that in spades. But Coolidge wasn't just continuing Harding's policies. He represented a deeper ideological shift that shaped the entire decade. Coolidge embodied the return of classical conservatism, limited government, laissez faire economics, and moral restraint. His guiding principle was simple, but radical in its simplicity. The federal government should do less, not more, and it should certainly stay out of the way of business. Coolidge's economic policies were laser focused on tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy. Policies spearheaded by Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, a titan of industry himself. Mellon's theory was that reduced taxes would free up capital for investment and job creation, an early version of what we would later call trickle down economics. Regulations were rolled back, antitrust enforcements all but stopped, labor protections were gutted, even the Federal Trade Commission was weakened, deliberately stripped of powers. The stock market, not surprisingly, loved it. The 1920s saw a surge in investment and consumer confidence. Profits soared, productivity rose, thanks to the new technologies like assembly lines, electrification, and mass advertising. And while average wages did go up, corporate profits rose far faster, and the wealth inequality deepened. But while Wall Street was partying, rural America was hurting. Farmers who had expanded production during World War I to feed war torn Europe were now drowning in surplus and falling prices. The government refused to offer real relief. Coolidge vetoed bills meant to help struggling agricultural communities, arguing it wasn't the federal government's job to prop up any one industry. This blind spot, or ideological stubbornness, would come back to haunt the nation. Coolidge wasn't interested in charismatic leadership. He was famously quiet, a man who once reportedly said, "If you don't say anything, you won't be called on to repeat it." That is the thing that earned him the nickname Silent Cal. But his silence wasn't apathy, it was philosophy. He genuinely believed that most of the problems of the government came from too much meddling and that markets, if left alone, would sort themselves out. In 1924, the country handed him a landslide victory. The Democratic Party was deeply divided that year, and a booming economy made the choice feel easy for many voters. Coolidge became the face of stability, a steady hand on the tiller during rapid changes. But even in this tightly managed landscape, something was shifting. In the same decade that celebrated old school capitalism, women were making inroads to political power. In 1922, Rebecca Latimer Felton briefly served as the first woman in US Senate, a symbolic appointment, but historic nonetheless. By 1925, more women were stepping into state legislatures, school boards, and local governments. Nellie Taylor Rose of Wyoming even became the first female governor in 1925. These changes didn't happen overnight. The women still faced enormous barriers, but the ripples of 19th Amendment were becoming waves. Still, Coolidge didn't dwell on social change. He was indifferent to calls for radical justice, silent on civil rights, and unmoved by labor demands. His version of America was clean, efficient, and capitalist to its core. In his own words, the chief business of American people is business. That line, now famous, wasn't just a slogan. It was a worldview, one that celebrated growth but ignored the warning signs. As factories sped up and skyscrapers climbed higher, so too did the national economic fragility. Debt soared, stock speculation ran wild, regulatory agencies were hollowed out. Beneath the facade of prosperity, the cracks were spreading. Coolidge left office in 1929, just months before the crash. He once said, "I have never been hurt by what I have not said." But history would prove otherwise. His silence, his caution, and his unwavering faith in the market helped set the stage for one of the greatest economic disasters the country would ever face. In 1920s, America discovered something powerful, that buying things could feel like freedom. After the strain of World War I, the country wasn't just looking to rebuild, it wanted to reimagine daily life. Factories once devoted to war production were now churning out toasters, radios, electric irons, and mass produced clothing. and for the first time, middle class Americans could afford them. It wasn't just about having more, it was about having what was new. This transformation was fueled by more than just manufacturing, it was the golden age of advertising, and advertisers were no longer content to sell soap for cleanliness, they sold it as confidence. Cigarettes weren't just nicotine, they were rebellion. A Ford car wasn't just a car, it was mobility, independence, modernity. Marketers studied consumer behavior, used Freudian psychology, and even hired artists and poets to craft their pitches. The line between want and need blurred, and the result was the birth of modern consumer identity. Installment buying or buying on credit made this new lifestyle accessible to people who couldn't pay upfront. It was the dawn of buy now, pay later, and it quietly rewired how Americans thought about money. Frugality gave way to desire. Saving became less important than owning. A refrigerator could be paid off in monthly chunks, so could a wristwatch, or a piano, or even a living room set. This was more than an economic trend. It was a cultural revolution. Being a good American was no longer just about hard work and virtue, it was about style, about keeping up. If you wore the latest fashion, drove a shiny new car, or hosted dinner with electric lighting, you were part of the future. This was a decade obsessed with looking modern. And these changes didn't stop when the decade ended. The consumer habits shaped in the 1920s became the blueprint for 20th century American life. The advertising techniques, the rise of brand loyalty, and emotional connection to products, they all carried forward into post World War II boom and well into our current digital marketplace. Shopping became entertainment, personal identity became linked to what you bought, and economic growth became tied to the consumption like never before. But this new identity came with costs, both literal and invisible. The roaring consumer economy of 1920s was built on a shaky foundation of debt and speculation, setting the stage for the 1929 stock market crash. The rise of consumer credit meant households were spending beyond their means, and while cities flourished, rural areas and working class communities were often left behind, deepening inequality. Even culturally, this era marked the beginning of chronic dissatisfaction, the sense that there is always something new to buy, some better version of yourself to become through a product. That feeling never really left. So, while 1920s might have introduced America to thrill of mass consumption, it also planted the seed of century of consumer anxiety, environmental strain, and society more often focused on appearance than substance. While Wall Street was booming and department stores were ringing up sales, something electric was happening in the heart of American cities. A cultural renaissance that pulsed with rhythm, color, and defiance. Nowhere was it more colorful than in Harlem, the beating heart of black artistic life in New York City. This was the jazz age, a time when America's soul found a new soundtrack. Jazz wasn't just music, it was rebellion. It bent rules, it improvised, it celebrated individual voice and collective energy at once. Born from African American spirituals, blues, and ragtime, jazz made its way from New Orleans to Chicago to Harlem, where it exploded into mainstream American culture. Artists like Louis Armstrong, Bessie Smith, and Duke Ellington packed clubs like the Cotton Club, even as segregation kept black audience out of the seats. Even today, songs of these legends are listened by millions. For me, Louis Armstrong's song Wonderful World is one of my all-time favorites. What a wonderful world. This was also the age of Harlem Renaissance, a flowering of African American literature, painting, poetry, and performance that demanded to be seen and heard. Writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston didn't just document black life, they elevated it. They explored what it meant to be black and American at a time when racism still shaped everything from housing to education to opportunity. The Harlem Renaissance was powerful precisely because it was rooted in pride. It wasn't assimilation, it was assertion. And while jazz gave the decade its sound, mass entertainment gave it the shared stage. The 1920s saw the rise of movie industry, with silent films drawing millions to glamorous new dream worlds. Hollywood began to shape American ideals of beauty, romance, and heroism, even as real life remained more complicated. Stars like Charlie Chaplin and Clara Bow became household names. The radio connected people from rural Kansas to Manhattan penthouses, tuning into the same voices, jokes, and dance tunes. This was also the era of flappers, young women who pushed back against Victorian norms by cutting their hair short, wearing looser clothes, and dancing the Charleston with wild abandon. The flapper wasn't just a fashion icon, she was a symbol of women trying to defend themselves outside the tight confines of tradition. But while the country celebrated this surge of expression, it also struggled with tension underneath. Black artists and musicians were still excluded from many of these venues they performed in. Women were still paid less, treated as novelties or troublemakers. Immigrants who helped build this new America often weren't invited to share fully in its cultural spotlight. Still, for one glittering decade, it felt like something truly new had taken root. A modern American identity not bound by the past but dancing confidently towards the future. For all its shine and celebration, the Roaring Twenties had a darker, most anxious undercurrent. Progress always had a price tag, and in 1920s, as jazz-filled clubs and cities stretched upwards, a cultural backlash was rising quietly in the background, ready to snap. For some, the country had changed too quickly. The rapid urbanization, the new freedoms of women, and visibility of black voices, the waves of immigration, and the rise of science, and the loosening grip of traditional values, all of these unsettled those who longed for an older, simpler version of America. And so began the pushback. One phase of this reaction was nativism, a deep fear that immigrants were diluting or even threatening the real America. While immigrants had long shaped the country, the new wave of Southern and Eastern Europe, Italians, Jews, Poles, Greeks, faced intense suspicion. The Immigration Act of 1924 didn't just slow the flow, it slammed the door shut on many would be newcomers, especially those not from the Northern or Western Europe. In the South and far beyond, the Ku Klux Klan re emerged, not just targeting African Americans but also Catholics, Jews, and immigrants. Marches down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. weren't fringe, they were mainstream, and their slogan, 100% Americanism. It wasn't just hate, it was a violent longing for mythic past that never really existed. Then came fundamentalism, a movement that saw science and modernity as threat to religious truth. Nowhere was this clash more dramatic than the Scopes trial of 1925, when a Tennessee teacher was tried for teaching evolution in public school. The trial became a national spectacle, pitting religious fundamentalist William Jennings Bryan against defense attorney Clarence Darrow. It wasn't just about biology, it was about what kind of nation America was becoming. Prohibition too became a moral battleground. The 18th Amendment had outlawed alcohol nationwide in 1920, driven by the temperance movement, which had deep roots in religious and social reform circles. But instead of ushering in moral renewal, prohibition gave birth to speakeasies, bootlegging empires, and gangster icons like Al Capone. That one law turned everyday citizens into lawbreakers and federal government into enforcers of a wildly unpopular policy. And even the cultural elites turned away. A group of disillusioned writers and intellectuals, later known as the Lost Generation, grew cynical with all the consumerism, conformity, and hypocrisy they saw in American life. Writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, and Gertrude Stein either criticized the culture or left the country altogether. For them, the party had an empty core. So while the 1920s roared, they also rattled. For every flapper dancing to jazz, there was a preacher denouncing her. For every new skyscraper, there was a law limiting who could live beneath it. For every step forward, there were whispers, and sometimes shouts demanding a step back. This tension between progress and backlash wasn't unique to 1920s, but in that decade it became a national tug of war, a story of light and shadow dancing to the same beat. By the late 1920s, America looked like the land of endless promise. The stock market was climbing like never before. Radio ads promised comfort and modern living. Factories buzzed, cities glowed, and everyone, from office clerks to barbers, seemed to be investing in stocks. People talked about market like it was a magic machine. Buy now, sell later, get rich. That was the mood. The future felt unstoppable. But beneath the jazz and shine, the foundation was really crumbling. The 1920s economy wasn't built on steady ground. It was propped up by debt, speculation, and uneven growth. While many middle class urban Americans were buying cars and fridges, rural America was hurting. The farmers had ramped up the production during World War I to feed Europe, but after the war, prices crashed, crops rotted in the field, and many farms were foreclosed. For them, the Great Depression had already begun before the rest of the country had even realized it. Then there was the stock market. Speculation ran wild. People were buying stocks on margin, meaning they paid only a small fraction upfront and borrowed the rest. It was like buying a $1,000 share by putting down $100, expecting it to rise and selling for a profit. But if the price dropped even a little bit, you would lose your investment and still owe the remaining 900. This made the market a house of cards. One gust and it could collapse. The banks weren't regulated like they are today. Many used their customers' deposit to invest in market, or worse, gave loans to speculators. If the market crashed, so would the banks. And with no FDIC, that is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, that meant people could lose their entire life savings overnight. Meanwhile, wages didn't keep up with production. The rich got richer, and working class families, especially in urban centers and among communities of color, barely scraped by. The booming economy depended on people continuing to buy more, but people could only buy so much. Overproduction met underconsumption, and shelves began to fill faster than wallets. And yet, nobody wanted to believe it. Newspapers cheered, politicians claimed prosperity was permanent, and we saw what President Calvin Coolidge said: business of America is business. And his successor, Herbert Hoover, he wasn't worried either. He believed the market would correct itself. But the warning signs were there: unstable banking practices, a widening wealth gap, and a bubble in stock market, and deep economic pain in large parts of the country. All it would take was a single spark, a moment when optimism gave way to panic. And that spark came in October 1929. But by then, the decade long party was over. The glitter couldn't hide the rot anymore. The country was dancing on edge of a cliff, and it didn't even know it. As the 1930s began, the United States was about to plunge into the deepest and most painful economic crisis in its history. One that would shape its politics, its people, and its very sense of purpose for generations to come. And that, my friend, was the Roaring Twenties, a decade that dazzled on surface but burned with tension underneath. This decade saw many firsts: first mass media, first major cultural movement by black Americans. Women came to politics for the first time. But it was also a decade of backlashes, of closed borders, banned books, roaring inequality. And as the stock market soared, few realized just how close they stood to the edge of historic collapse. Next time we step into the storm, the Great Depression, the crash, the hunger, the dust, the New Deal, but also the resilience of people who refuse to give up. If this episode made history feel real to you, or if you could draw parallels between then and now, please consider supporting this podcast, share it with a friend, leave a review, or rate this podcast. Until then, stay curious, stay kind, and remember, history isn't just about the past. It's about how we got here, and what mistakes we did through all this time, and why we shouldn't make the same mistakes again. Signing off for now. See you in the next chapter. Bye bye.